the West and Europe and the United States and the Ukrainians too all seem to be a lot less afraid of Russia and the nuclear threat now than they were. And I think what you're talking about is, there's been talk in Ukraine about liberating Crimea and going, all the way through there. Is it a mistake? Is there a point at which we should be more afraid than we are? Because I think, mentioning the nuclear threat, the Biden administration doesn't seem to be too concerned with that now. Otherwise, they wouldn't have agreed to, send tanks to Ukraine or some of those red lines that Putin had said. But do we risk a mistake? Do we risk kind of backing into a major power, potentially nuclear conflict if we're not careful?
Well, okay, so this gets to the question of these red lines and, are they moving? And I think it's important. You mentioned the Biden administration. I think it's important to acknowledge that the Biden administration has been very clear since before the outbreak of war, that we were not going to be directly involved in terms of sending our own troops and directly fighting and bumping up against Russian soldiers. That's something that I think people have forgotten a lot about, because I think that in the Putin calculus, this fed this notion that this is an opportunity, because we said we're out. Now, all the surprises were how well we've trained and supported and how well Ukrainians have performed and et cetera. But I think when we think about where we're headed, and what's transpired. Yes, we didn't think. We were debating about javelins. Then we were debating about HIMARS. Then we were debating about Leopard 2s and M1A1s. Then we're debating about extending the ranges of some of these missiles, maybe even aircraft. Right. So the lines have shifted, but the overarching message, I think, from the Biden administration has been they're not going to get directly involved in Ukraine, in fighting in Ukraine against Russians. And they're going to put clear limits on what Ukraine can do in terms of attacking Russian territory, right? What's been the slippery dimension has been where, because Putin very early on, within a week of mounting that sort of shock and awe attempt in February of 2022, all of a sudden he used the term red line, and he brandished in an opaque way a special procedure, operational procedure of readiness for nuclear forces, right? He has popped off in ways that he has never before about red lines. By the way, the Kremlin does not use the term red line very frequently. We've actually done some research, and they've only explicitly used the term red line as a Russian president from 2000 to today about 54 times. 50% of those times have been used in 2021 and 2022 and 2023. They've been concentrated around this war. But you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of a red line? For us, red line is all about deterrence. It's about making your adversary unambiguously clear that where that line in the sand is, and don't cross or else. So a red line has to have a threat and a consequence to it that have to be very explicit. And the reason you make a red line statement in public is so your adversary knows it's very difficult for you to worm out of that commitment, because you'll suffer either reputational costs in the international community or domestic political costs at home for backing down. We saw a lot of the discussion around Obama and the red lines in Syria, right? And so red lines are very explicit, have to be very clear, and they're aimed at deterring. When we look at all those incidents of red lines by Putin, and especially in 2022, they're not clear. He's rarely clear about what the threat is. He never mentions the consequence of crossing. There is not one speech where he has mentioned red lines and nuclear in the same paragraph or discussion, right? There are 14 speeches out of 12,000 speeches where those two are in the same speech, but they're not about the same thing. It's not about a nuclear consequence to crossing a red line. So we need to be very careful about what is it that he's actually saying when he issues these kinds of threats. And so I would argue that yes, he's been using red lines, but in a different way than we do. It's been more out of weakness to create uncertainty, maybe so we become self-deterred because we don't know what he's talking about, and all of a sudden it sparks a debate in the West about using nuclear weapons and the risk of him using tactical nuclear weapons or even strategic nuclear weapons, things that he's not even saying. But we've now integrated that into the conversation. Or do we, Crimea is a red line, or Donbass is a red line, or providing offensive systems is a red line versus defensive. These are debates that we're having, and he's all over the map in that, not sending very clear signals that would be used as a red line as we talk about it. So I'd be very careful about them two things. One, I don't think the Biden administration has been ambiguous about putting some severe limits on how much we're going to get engaged and to how directly we're going to be getting engaged. And Putin, I don't think, is using these red lines the same way we think about red lines. But the problem may be that we think he's using red lines the way that we use them. And as a result, we see us blowing through some of these ideas that either he's saying or we're thinking he's saying, and we're getting more and more emboldened by that.